Miguel Lau works for International Justice Mission, an organization that works to bring justice by dealing with the root of injustice, violence. If you've ever struggled with how the idea of justice fits into your faith, you will want to hear this interview.
Welcome to a World of Good podcast. I'm Nate Tatman.
And I'm Andrew Gale.
And we are two friends
who love Jesus,
care about the church,
and travel the world to share stories of people who do the same.
Our conversations happen in all kinds of places.
Like a coffee shop and an airport terminal.
Or even the back of a crowded taxi.
But no matter where we go, from Argentina to Zimbabwe,
we capture stories of the good God is doing around the world.
And we hope those stories will do you a world of good.
Welcome to a World of Good podcast. I am Nate Tatman here with my co-host Andrew Gale. Andrew, how are you doing today in beautiful Anderson, Indiana, correct?
Yeah, it's very nice here. The sun's out. We've had some rain, but right now it feels a lot less like fall as it did, this last week. But my only complaint right now is that I'm looking at you sitting next to a pool while I am in my office at work, and I don't feel like this is a very fair trade-off.
Oh no! There is no reason to be jealous or to think that I am anywhere in a tropical warm environment right now. So we are in Rock Spring, Wyoming. We are staying at a hotel, and we are on our way to Colorado Springs. So we are. I'm sure it's below freezing outside right now.
I know, but you're sitting next to a pool. I don't know that you heard me say that, because that's what you're doing. You're sitting next to a pool, and I'm in my office. This is not fair.
I have no words because I'm not. I mean, if I will take a picture of this pool and we will post it on our Instagram, and everybody will see what I am talking about. There is no reason to be jealous. But we are our family's wrapping up a 4-week road trip in Colorado Springs. We're going to be there for a few days before we start our pre-field missions training at MTI, Missionary Training International. And so we've been on the road for almost 4 weeks, and we've tallied it up. We've spent over 100 hours in our van.
Wow.
And I think we're north of 4,500 miles.
Wow,
that we've,
that's awesome.
And we're, I think, about 10 states, 9 or 10 different states. So it's been a lot of fun traveling around, visiting with people and seeing some of the great places in the north and northwest. So we've had a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Yeah, and we're excited for you to get to start that pre-field training, which starts next week, right?
Yeah, Monday afternoon.
A busy schedule ahead of you. Well, for those that want to learn more about our podcast or reach out to us, we'd love to hear from you. As a reminder, you can follow us on Twitter, A World of Good Pod. You can go to Instagram and search for A World of Good Podcast. We post updates to our Global Strategy Facebook page. We have a website where you can learn more information. There's lots of places where you can connect. You can sign up on the website to get new episodes in your email inbox. But at the end of the day, we'd love for you to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. To write a review would be awesome. But most of all, we'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, if there are things you would like us to talk about or engage with, we would love to hear what it is that you're processing and how we could be a part of bringing some conversations around those ideas. So please reach out.
Thanks, Andrew. And what do you have for Coffee Talk?
Now for Coffee Talk.
So today on Coffee Talk, I mentioned this at the last episode, that I want to kind of start some conversations related to this book and related to kind of coffee and justice. I felt like that would be a really great connection because today our interview is with Miguel Lau, who works at International Justice Mission. So I some of this has been taken from the book The Taste of Many Mountains by Bruce Wydick. You can actually, thanks Nate for finding this, you can actually buy the book on Kindle for $3.49. It's on sale right now. So if you're listening to this soon after publishing this episode, you should go out and get a copy of it. It's a really fascinating read.
And to that point, I think it was like $8 for a soft or hardcover. I can't remember. So either $8 if you want it in your hand or $3.49 on your Kindle app.
And it's definitely worth worth the read. So I mentioned this book last episode, but I want to bring it up again. It's a fictional story, but it's based on research that was done by a group of grad students to look at the amount of profit that's made at each stage of the coffee process. So, how much does the farmer make? And then when it gets processed, and the hands that it passes through before it gets to the roastery, then the hands that it goes to eventually get to your cup. The book takes place primarily in Guatemala and weaves in these multiple layers of cultural interaction. It's really fascinating. There's some European grad students. There is the Guatemalans they interact with. There's American students, but also in terms of faith. Faith is woven in throughout this as well. So one big takeaway from this book for me is the disparity between the coffee producing world and the coffee consuming world. So the statistics are really startling between the third world, or what gets called the majority world, where coffee is grown, and the first world, or the minority world, where most of coffee is consumed. So just some statistics that I got from this book that I think would be great for people to be aware of. Kids in the majority world are 10 times more likely to die before the age of 5 than kids in the minority world. So kids in the coffee producing world are 10 times more likely to die before the age of 5 than kids in the coffee consuming world. So of those kids that make it past 5, 1 in 6 will be chronically malnourished.
Wow.
I know, isn't that crazy?
Wow. Yeah.
Another important part of the coffee producing world is the rate of violence. And this theme is going to get woven into the interview later. So I just think it really connects well. So listen to this. This is a crazy statistic. Not one of the top 24 coffee-consuming countries, so like the United States, not one of them has experienced a civil war in the last 50 years, which is wonderful. But in contrast, many of the top coffee-producing countries have. You think of Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Rwanda, Vietnam. They had a long list. That's just a number of them. Have experienced some kind of civil unrest in recent years. So not only is there a disparity in terms of economics, but there's a disparity in terms of violence and safety. And I wanted to bring that up because I think that the next time that we drink a cup of coffee, I want us to be thinking about how much we paid for it. And in reality, the data shows that the income of coffee drinkers is probably at least 100 times that of the man, woman, or child that picked the coffee beans that were used to make that cup of coffee. 100 times. I don't share this in any ways to induce guilt. I don't think guilt actually moves us towards any kind of sustained change in our life, so I'm not trying to make anyone feel guilty. Guilt really only changes things temporarily. The goal is that we're just made aware of it so that we can make informed choices, that we can think about the decisions that we're making. Awareness can lead to more questions, which can ultimately lead to lasting change. It comes back to that question that I ask, where does this come from? When I drink this cup of coffee, I ask the question, where did it come from? And, for me, I know that I bought these coffee beans from a local coffee distributor who works with coffee growers. And this cup is from Colombia. So I know that she was working with these farmers that produced these beans. That it was done through transparent trade. That she then sold them to me and I roasted them. So I feel like I can drink this knowing that there is at least some connection back to the people who made them.
So is there, and maybe this is in the book, maybe it's not, maybe you don't know, but is there a direct correlation between the coffee being grown, the coffee producers, and the violence that's happening in those countries? Does it get into that at all?
Nate, I'm going to have to do more research on that. And maybe that's something I can bring up in our next Coffee Talk segment, is how does violence connect to, why is violence so connected to these coffee producing regions? Mm-hmm. I do think that these coffee producing regions tend to be lower socioeconomically, and when there is and often in places where there's low socioeconomic status, there is also those that are very wealthy, and so there tends to be higher disparity between those two. And we know that when there is large disparities between the wealthy and the poor, there's a lot more opportunity for there to be violence. And so I don't know, though, exactly how those fit together. And so I will do some research, and in a future Coffee Talk episode, we will connect some of those pieces together, maybe bring some thoughts as to why these coffee-producing regions are places where there is so much disparity in terms of economics, which then I think is a huge part in leading towards violence.
Yeah, because I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, whether or not it's coffee or, in other countries, it could be produce, it's other production that could
Chocolate,
be
cocoa, all of that.
Yeah. What you have in Colombia and other places in South America. So I feel like, again, going back to this guilt thing, because I am feeling rather guilty this morning. I'm drinking my coffee, actually from the those little paper cups that you put in your room.
Yeah.
But I made my own coffee from my AeroPress. So we brought our AeroPress and a hot water pitcher thing. And I think our coffee beans that we're drinking now are from Caribou Coffee. We stopped off and picked up a bag, but I have no idea, where it came from. So I think you're raising a very, very important question here in terms of, where do you know where your coffee comes from? I think because of the coffee culture between the coffee producing world and the coffee consuming world, there are those roasters, those farmers, those producers who are sensitive to this. And so I think any of us can probably find somebody in our city, in our community, or online where we can purchase our coffee and consume our coffee from those places that have those types of relationships and know where the coffee is coming from and who it is benefiting. And it is such an important conversation to have, such an important question to have.
Absolutely. And, I'll say that this disparity is not new. When coffee was first introduced into Europe, which was, if I recall from the book, in the 1600s, it was loved by Europeans, but really quickly found that they could not actually grow the coffee there in their countries, and in England, France, and some of the places where it took off. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up having their coffee grown in the colonies that they were settling. So, they were French and Dutch and English colonies that were growing the coffee that were then consumed in these countries. And so this disparity didn't start with the United States, but it's been perpetuated through the years, that often the places that are consuming the coffee are not the places that are producing it. So just really interesting. And again, something I think we need to check out the book. It has a lot of great information. So Nate, tell us what's in the news.
So I found this article yesterday. The title of it is 2/3 of U.S. young adults unaware 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Poll shows. So that's the kind of the title of the article. And this was published just a few weeks ago, September 16th. Actually, I take that back. So this was published about a month ago on claimscon.org, and some of those findings are just now being released out into the public. And I thought it was interesting. That title alone kind of caught my eye. And so as I was reading through this, these findings from this poll are fascinating. So a couple of things about this survey. It's the first ever 50-state survey on Holocaust knowledge among millennials and Gen Z. Surprising state-by-state results highlight a worrying lack of basic Holocaust knowledge, a growing problem as fewer and fewer Holocaust survivors who are eyewitnesses to a state-sponsored genocide are alive to share the lessons of the Holocaust. So some of the key findings in this poll, it found that 63% of all national survey respondents do not know that 6 million Jews were murdered. 2/3 of those surveyed did not know that 6 million Jews were murdered.
Is it that they didn't know the number? Like they didn't realize that it was that many?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was part of it. So
they knew that some were, that there were people killed. They just didn't know how large that number was.
Correct. Okay. 36% thought that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed during the Holocaust, which has the implications, right? Because if it's 6 million Jews versus less than 2 million, well, it's not that big of a deal. Only 2 million versus no, it was a big deal. 6 million Jews were murdered. And then, although there were more than 40,000 camps and ghettos in Europe during the Holocaust, 48%, a little less than half of the national survey respondent cannot name a single one. So almost half of those could not name one of those 40,000 camps or ghettos.
Wow.
And then one of the more alarming results found that nearly 20% of those surveyed, which again, they were specifically looking at millennials and the Gen Z generation, but 20% of those living in New York feel that Jews caused the Holocaust.
Wow.
20%. So they kind of use three criteria, kind of basic criteria to create what they call a knowledge score. And I'm putting air quotes around knowledge score. But the first one is that they have definitively heard about the Holocaust. The second part is can name at least one concentration camp, death camp, or ghetto, and know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. So that's the kind of the baseline. Those are the qualifiers to know of what their knowledge score. And then what they did is they went through and they ranked all 50 states and could determine which state had the highest knowledge of the Holocaust, which I believe was Wisconsin, and then those states with that did not score as well. So obviously, overall, this is not good news. It's kind of reflective maybe of what is being taught in schools through our educational system on the Holocaust, maybe what's out there in our culture and that sort of thing too. And it was mind-boggling to me. It appears this part of our history, of our world history, is becoming less and less known, or becoming further and further into the background, as we go through these different generations and various generations removed from the Holocaust and when this happened. And so I know there's several Holocaust museums around the country that people can go to. Obviously, there's many, many books out there. There's movies, that families can watch together. But I just felt like we cannot continue to lose the history of what happened during the Holocaust. And
I wonder if this is connected at all to location and place. I was listening recently to a book that I'm going to talk about in just a second, and one of the comments that was made in the book is that for us to deal with the history we've had before, we need to take people to the locations. And so it was talking about racial injustice, and that we need to go to the places where there were marches, and we need to go to the location where Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, and we need to go and be a part of these conversations, because we need to be in those locations. Have to continue to have meaning and resonance with people so that they can understand that this happened here. I wonder at all if part of the disconnect is that this feels like for Americans that it happened somewhere else, that there aren't locations that they can go to. I know you've visited locations, but I wonder if they haven't been able to walk through those locations and feel the reality of it. So it still feels very much like a story they're hearing, not like a reality that they're living through.
Absolutely. I think, to your point, our family visited some of those sites in the South.
Yeah.
We going through especially the states of Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, and it brings those issues to the forefront. And, again, through those, a lot of educational type centers, things like that, information centers. And so it brought the whole civil rights movement, it became very real for our family, being able to walk those streets and drive through those cities and learn about those people in that time. So I think location absolutely has a lot to do with that. And obviously here in the U.S., we don't have those locations that we can go to, but we do have Holocaust museums that we can visit.
I was going to say the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. is one of the most incredible, challenging, difficult places to walk through, but it really does. It's the closest thing to bringing us to the locations where these things happen and helping us to be aware of that.
I do know I have not visited this location, but my parents have, and they it was the first time they visited anything like it, and it was in Detroit. So apparently there's a very good one in Detroit as well for those living in the Midwest.
Well, I heard a quote yesterday in the book The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby, and the book details the complicity of the church in racial injustice. And in one chapter, he talks about how a black pastor, Thabiti Anyabwile, a pastor in D.C., who was challenged on his stance of racial justice as not being the true gospel. He was told that, the way he was talking about racial justice, it really wasn't the gospel. It was societal or cultural. And in a blog in 2016, Anyabwile said that the pushback he received was not because he had changed his stance on any issues. Like, he still saw himself, he was still connected to a lot of those culturally Christian issues, but because he started talking about justice. So Anya Bwile writes, and this is a quote from his blog, "But mention justice, and that wall of evangelical troops splits like the Red Sea and turns against itself. Men who worked as fellow combatants in the traditional culture war begin to suspect and even attack one another when justice becomes the topic." So this idea that justice is somehow not part of the true gospel, it can be found all over the church. I think that, and we talk about this in the interview, how justice has so many different definitions and connotations that we miss out on understanding justice from a scriptural, from a faith perspective. And maybe people listening feel that way. Maybe they feel like, justice, we've lost that word. We need to let it go. It has too much baggage with it. And if you do, I really hope you'll listen to this interview with Miguel Lau. He's a senior officer of Church Partnerships for International Justice Mission. I hope you'll listen to it and listen to the way that he talks about justice. In this interview, Miguel and I explore justice in terms of the Bible, society, violence, and the church. Miguel joined me via Zoom, so you will probably hear some background noise. His preschool kids were upstairs getting work done, so you will hear some background noise. But I think you'll find this to be a really challenging interview about the way that we as a church should engage in justice. So here's the interview with Miguel. Well, welcome, Miguel Lau. We're so grateful that you're here today for this conversation about the work that IJM International Justice Mission does. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from Washington, D.C.
Since we can't see you, are you in your office with all the COVID stuff? What is life like for you right now, where you are?
No, I am in a makeshift space that I've been able to create, in my home.
Yeah.
So just a little corner of our basement that I've been able to set up as my workspace, out of the way of the kids.
Yeah, the basement office. This is the new corner office. Is now the basement office. So I think we're all living that reality.
That's right.
Well, thanks for joining us, Miguel. We're so grateful to have this conversation about justice today. So the organization you work for is International Justice Mission. So for those that don't know what IJM does, tell us about this organization. What do you guys do? What are your main goals?
Sure. Yeah, International Justice Mission is an international human rights agency, and we always have seen our mission as being twofold. First, a mission to protect those living in poverty from violence. We partner with local authorities in 19 different program offices in 11 countries to combat slavery, violence against women and children, and other forms of abuse against people living in poverty. We do this by rescuing and restoring victims, holding perpetrators accountable, and helping strengthen public justice systems to build a safe future that lasts. Now, our second mission we've always seen as a mission to engage the church in this work. We're a global team of Christian lawyers and social workers, investigators, and community activists and professionals. And we believe that the scriptures have called us to this work and that this work ultimately belongs to the church. And in my role at IJM, I have the privilege to lead a team that is doing that, is engaging churches all around the world in the work of justice.
That's awesome. This podcast, our goal is to talk about how the church engages in the work that's going on in the world. So I'm grateful that you're bringing this conversation to us today. So how many countries do you guys work in? Do you know offhand?
Yeah, we work in 11 different countries. Where our program offices are based. That number is sometimes changing every day because there's new assessments that are happening about where our work could expand to. But currently, 11 different countries where our work is actually based, and then there are a few countries that are actually partner countries that actually help with mobilizing the church and mobilizing the resources that are needed to do the work. Places like the United States, the UK, Germany, Australia, that are actually sending the resources that are needed to do the work in our program office.
Awesome. And you said that you work with churches, that your role is to work with churches all over the world. So does that mean that churches all over the world are engaged in the work of IJM, or is that just education pieces? Like, what does that look like to engage those churches around the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on the program or the office that we're talking about. But I would say, in short, yes, that means that the church is actually at work, that we've been able to partner with the church in various countries to see them really contribute sacrificially to the mission, either through their action, through their voices, sacrificially giving.
That's awesome.
And ways that they care for survivors and accompanying them through justice systems.
Wow, that's incredible. That's awesome. The name of the organization is International Justice Mission. So when they use the word justice, this is what I really want to talk about today. I want to get into this term because I think that it's a fascinating word that gets used in a lot of different ways in our culture and context. But what does the organization mean when they use the word justice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to go back to biblically as we think about that concept of justice. I mean, it is a big term. That we can put a lot of things underneath. I think the key way that IJM thinks about it is in terms of the right use of power.
Wow.
As we look at biblically the way that God lays out, I mean, when you think about the fall and what was broken in the fall, what was broken was our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, and our relationship with creation. And injustice happens when people misuse the power that has been entrusted to them against others and against our world. And so we're particularly focused on issues of violence, that particular slice of injustice, in that abuse of power of the strong against the weak. We see that expressed certainly through things like trafficking and slavery, abuse, violence against women and children, all those kinds of casework that we do. The common thread through all of them is that they focus their issues of violence perpetrated by one person on another. The other characteristic that's important to consider with that is the systems in which these people live, right? So the actual the question of whether or not the criminal justice system, the public justice system, actually serves its people. And so where IJM has chosen to work in particular, the reason why this isn't relevant to the question of justice, is places where the system itself is not serving those living in poverty.
Yeah.
And so there is a second kind of injustice that is happening where, again, the power that has been entrusted to those governments or to those law enforcement bodies is not being properly used to protect the poor from violence.
Yeah.
And hence that is another form of injustice.
That's so helpful. And that's kind of two different ways that word justice gets used. Because I know when a lot of people hear the word justice, I think one of our first inclinations is to think about the criminal justice system. So, the images we see are like, gavels and judges and courtrooms, which is certainly the arena that International Justice Mission works in. I mean, working with the criminal justice system around the world. But it's also that connection back to the biblical concept of justice, which is more tied to, not that that's not a part of it, but it's also tied to things like shalom and peace and connectivity with one another, like you said, between God, between each other and ourselves and with creation. When you guys talk about justice in a biblical perspective, what kind of things are you pulling out there? Where do you go to find how you define justice in the Bible?
Yeah, I do think that the concept of justice is really something that you find throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament, because the trajectory of Scripture is the restoration of creation, right? The restoration of relationships and the restoration of that kind of right use of power. When we think about wholeness, the wholeness, the shalom that God intends to bring to all of creation, that means that justice would actually flourish, right?
Yeah.
So we have scriptures like, in Amos, let justice roll down, like a mighty river. You have in Isaiah, learn to do justice, seek to correct oppression, to defend the orphan, to plead for the widow. When you move to the New Testament, the way that Christ calls us to love one another, right? John the Baptist's call to those in authority to use their power correctly.
Yeah.
What Paul writes about, government being entrusted with the sword for a reason. Like all of these things are about a picture that God is painting of the way that the world should work and what he is actually putting back together. And that is throughout Scripture. The resurrection really is the inauguration of that kind of justice again.
Absolutely.
And that's what we think we're called to be a part of restoring.
That's awesome. Yeah, when you mentioned that Amos passage, it's one that connects justice and righteousness together, right? We see those two terms kind of going hand in hand, and when you look in the Old Testament, you see those terms kind of together. You can kind of trace the trajectory of those throughout the Old Testament. And in Hebrew, there are two terms, which is great. In the New Testament, we get down to hearing more about righteousness than justice. And, part of that is because, in Greek, there is one term that gets translated as both of those rather than two separate terms. Do you ever feel like you have to convince people that justice is a part of the New Testament? Like, I feel like we read the term so often in the Old Testament, and then it feels like it's gone in the New Testament. Even though it's not, it's just not used. That word doesn't show up. Do you ever find yourself having to convince people, or how do you talk about that? How do you help people see justice as connected in the New Testament?
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. And there's been great writing on the Greek term that's behind the word justice there, which actually alternately is translated justice and righteousness in different points. Mm-hmm. I think one of my favorite New Testament passages that speaks to this is in the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled, or they will be satisfied. That word can also be translated justice. Right? So blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst essentially for that rightness in the world. They will be satisfied. And you actually find that in alternate translations in other languages, in Spanish, for example, that comes through a little bit more clearly, that idea that it's actually both. It's not just about personal righteousness, but it's how that righteousness is expressed in the world and in our relationships with one another.
That's exactly right. Like, righteousness in Spanish is justicia. So even though we don't see it in our English translation, our brothers and sisters around the world see that term justice all throughout their translations.
Mm-hmm. And you actually do find that in non-English speaking contexts, there is more openness, understanding of this way that our God's restoration of the world is expressed in justice being seen. Even the idea of integral mission, right? So, which is an evangelical concept, right? That we're putting the world is being put back to right. That's a term that emerged from Latin America, And so that's just an interesting way that a privilege that I have in my role is that I get a chance to interact with the church around the world and get a chance to see the way that they're actually expressing this. It's helping all of us.
Which is such a great reminder that we have to be listening to our brothers and sisters around the world and how they approach their faith, because it can help inform the way we understand ourselves and the way we interact in the world. I love that you brought up that Matthew 5 passage. One of the things I love about that is that word righteousness that gets used is the only term that gets used twice in the Beatitudes, because then later it also says, blessed are you when you're persecuted because of righteousness' sake. And so it's fascinating that of all the different, all these different terms that are the blesseds, the Beatitudes, righteousness is the only one that happens twice, which just, in my mind, it makes me ask the question, if Jesus was not speaking in Greek at the time, which was the translation, if he was speaking in Aramaic, would he have used two separate terms there? And would one of them have actually been justice? And so do we have to, think about that as we read those? I think you're exactly right to challenge us to read that with that word in mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to think about that, to think about what, how this may have been expressed in the context. And again, when you look at even the totality of the commands, that, who Jesus actually is, right? He is the fulfillment of the hope of the Old Testament. And that's the total hope of the Old Testament, right? The prophet's hope for a world that is just is encapsulated in Jesus himself. And so the way that he lives his life, the way that he interacts with those who are marginalized, right? That's the calling. That's the world that is envisioned in Jesus. Right. And so even in the ways that he teaches all throughout his life and in the expression of his death and resurrection.
Absolutely.
Right. I think you see justice being the hope of justice being expressed, the hope of a world being put back together again.
One of the challenges I think for Americans, for English speakers, is that justice just has a lot of meanings in our world today. It gets used in all kinds of different ways, all kinds of different circles. I grew up not really hearing the word justice in the church. Or when I did, it was associated with like social justice, which, had a very bad connotation the way that it was described. As you look across the landscape of the church, do you find the word justice as a part of our vocabulary as Christians? And if so, what does that look like? And if not, why? Like, why has that not permeated our churches in the same way that it has, like you said, other churches around the world?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And again, that's what I said before about the church around the world having a stronger concept of that whole understanding of Scripture and that whole understanding of justice is not fully even, right? Because we also have exported sometimes a view of the Bible that omits the concept of justice, and how our faith is expressed in the world. But I agree. I think that there has been a challenge historically that goes back. I think there's some history to that in terms of the, and you can read a little. I'm sure your listeners know about the liberal conservative split that happened within particularly the Western church, of this understanding of, the desire to hold to an orthodox understanding of the Scriptures, and the association of, people who seem to be more passionate about social justice causes, or the causes of alleviating poverty, or issues of justice. Also, coincidentally, many of them had more liberal views on Scripture. And so there was this moment of saying, well, it must all be bad then.
Yeah.
Right? So maybe that becomes a distraction to our faith. And that really what we need to be focusing on is our relationship with God, right? And ensuring that people have that right relationship with God, because ultimately that is, for them, eternal salvation. It can make us short-sighted.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's what's happened, is that it's made us as a church short-sighted in terms of even the way that we preach the gospel. I love what Tim Keller actually writes on this, and he talks about how Keller and N.T. Wright also writes about this as well, in Surprised by Hope, and talking about how when we actually do the work of justice, it can actually be one of the greatest expressions we have of the gospel.
Yeah.
The greatest expression we have to a watching world that wants to know, well, what is this Jesus all about? Well, they watch our lives as well for what that testimony is. And so when we as the church are about the work of justice, it actually, it is one of the challenges that we have to the world, to say, this is what the good news is, right? It's the good news of a God who puts people back together again in relationship with him, in relationship with themselves, and in relationship with others, and in relationship with the world. That is the God who cares about the suffering of others. I think that's one of the greatest gifts that we have as a church, is to be able to do the work of justice as a witness. But it has been a challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, just to be honest, it has been a tremendous challenge. In some spaces, to begin that conversation is fraught, because people are bringing into it perhaps negative associations they have politically with the term, negative associations they have theologically or historically with the term, because of the people who have used it to justify their own beliefs. But I don't think that should discourage us from really exploring what God is saying in the Scriptures about justice. There's plenty there about how he challenges us to live. And I will say one more thing on that, and this is to say that many evangelicals that I've met, many Western Christians that I've met, it's funny that they get distracted by the term, because their lives really are truly, they're generous people who are kind and want to see suffering alleviated of others, but they naturally gravitate towards this because God is making them into new people.
Yeah.
Right? We have been made new by the gospel. And so of course we desire these things. So the fact that we get hung up on a term and associate it with all these other negative things, we forget the fact that this actually it's God's word. This is not a liberal word or a conservative word. It's not a word of people who don't believe in God. This is God's word. This is his word. This is the thing that he wants to see happen in the world.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think is so difficult about language, right? You get to a point with words where you either decide we have to discard this word because it has so much baggage associated with it, or we have to renegotiate what we mean by this term. We have to say that, no, it doesn't mean all these other things, and this is one of those words. There's other words that I'm okay discarding, but this is one of those that I feel like we have to find a way to see this the way that it was intended, the way that like, as you said, that God intended, the way that it is expressed in Scripture, because there's such a depth to it when you really engage that term justice and that idea, far more than just the simplistic diatribes or associations that it gets connected to.
Yeah, indeed. I do think, when we've seen in the lives of the survivors that we get the privilege of working with, we have this just wealth of, just this tremendous blessing of seeing how the gospel really was a blessing to their lives. The gospel in the sense of it has called a people to be different, and that they would make a different world around them. And that becomes a testimony to them. It becomes a testimony to the watching world.
Absolutely.
And the question we used to ask, I think sometimes flippantly, was, well, how do you actually, what is good news to the boy, Kumar, who is in the brick kiln and has no hope of escape, has no hope of ever encountering a missionary who could preach the gospel to him because he's trapped working 16 hours a day, every day, right? What's the good news to him? Well, the good news is the people of God rising up and saying, this practice should end and Kumar should be free. Free so he can hear and believe, right? Free so he can live a life of fruitfulness that God intends for him. Free so that his dignity would be restored and that the image of God in him would be fully seen. That is really the good news, right? Of the restoration.
Absolutely. But I think that connects to, a broader question. I think the church wrestles a lot with dealing with some of the underlying systemic problems that are going on in the world. And we tend to, I think we can easily be courted by the easy answers and by the simple responses. So, I think churches are much more, I speak for myself. It's a lot easier for me to try to get Kumar food, this boy in the kiln, to try to talk about education, to try to send him food, to do the compassionate side of things. But that only gets us so far, because if he continues to live his life 16 hours a day in a kiln, we can feed him, but we're not getting him out of the situation. There's a system in place that keeps him from flourishing. And so we have to eventually go after that system, or we have to eventually ask the question, is that a fair system? Is that right? And I think that's one of the things that you guys are doing that's really fascinating, but I think it's where we can, as a church, have sometimes fallen short. There's a quote by I think he was a Catholic thinker, Elder Camara, who said, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask while they're poor, they call me a communist. That when we start to deal with these systemic issues, right, it suddenly becomes outside the realm of our faith. What we need to do is just the compassionate work. So how do you guys challenge that? How do you approach that? Because so much of your work is dealing with the systems that are already in place in these different countries around the world.
Yeah, and I do think that is really, when you think about IJM, the heart of our calling is to deal with those systems, right? So we are, of course, always about the one and wanting to see individual people who God knows their name, knows their hopes and dreams, to be restored and to be protected from violence. Of course, individuals like Kumar. But what we believe our skill set has, where our focus lies, is on actually sustainably transforming those justice systems in which the Kumars of the world live.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that the thing that I think about when you say that is that God doesn't draw a borderline.
Yeah.
Right. He doesn't say, okay, up to this point is biblical and what I've called you to. Right. It doesn't say, okay, do all this sacrificial work of educating and feeding and compassionate work, but that's where it can stop.
Yeah.
God calls us to dream with him, right? And as he makes us into new people, as he has made us into new people, as he's called us into himself, of course within us is going to grow this desire to deal with all these other bigger questions.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons why we often stop short is fear. I mean, it is in large part, it is fear. I think it feels tremendously overwhelming. to think about, how do you deal with the system, the broken system that is behind this injustice that I'm seeing?
Yeah, that's a lot longer work. That's a lot harder work.
Exactly. It is. And it can feel tremendously overwhelming. But we have a core saying inside of IJM that this is God's weight to bear. It would be silly for us to think that somehow it is our responsibility to transform the world, right? And to make it right. It isn't. It's God's weight to bear. It is our work that it's his joy to invite us into this work, but it is his weight to bear for that transformation.
Yeah.
And so when you have that set, right, that gives you hope in those situations. The other thing, the other passage I think about is the 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? So this feeding of the 5,000, God calls us to offer what we have. And if what you have is to compassionately serve someone who has suffered from violence, right? And you don't know how to do the rest of it, then I don't think you should be ashamed of that. I think that absolutely do that with all of your passion and desire. But also don't stop short mentally of asking the question and praying for God to fill in the gap, right? Because that's the miracle of the 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? This boy just says, well, I have this, and he offers that to God. And what does Jesus do with that? He creates the miracle, right? The thing that is way beyond that little boy's capacity, that little boy's lunch's capacity. And he invites the disciples to actually do the work of handing out the food. I mean, it's just the amazing part of the way that he's involved his people in this, in the miracle itself. So God, I think, is about transforming those systems. He takes all of our little offerings along the way of the church in Mumbai, who, is passionately just raising the little funds that they have for an aftercare home that serves survivors, right? And that is asking questions about, how do we serve? How can we serve and love these people? The church in Ghana on the lake, that says we will watch out for children who are potentially getting trafficked, right? And we will alert people to that. Like that's their 5 loaves and 2 fish. But that fits in with a larger whole of the transformative work that is happening all around the world. And that's what gives us great hope, because that's God's work.
Absolutely. You've talked a little about violence, and I wanna make this connection for those that may not directly make it. So a few years ago, Gary Haugen wrote a book called The Locust Effect, where he suggests that in order to end poverty, we have to first engage and do something about violence against people, that those things go hand in hand, that we can, and it's very similar to what we were just talking about, we can do this, the compassionate work, but if we don't end violence, poverty is going to continue to be a perpetual problem. So can you expand that idea? I feel like that connects so directly in with what you guys do. Give us a sense of how those things interplay, and how the church, certainly you're right. There's a part where the church can do the compassionate work, but how we have to also be connected to organizations, at least, that are working towards the systemic issues of violence that may perpetuate poverty and people living in poverty.
Yeah, and I don't want to oversimplify this point, but I think a good way to frame it is to say, when I was a pastor, right? So before coming to IJM, we worked on a project in northern Uganda, right? In Gulu. A space that had been ravaged by civil war, people who were recovering from essentially community trauma. And how do you actually rebuild a community from there? And so we worked on building a vocational training school and, other poverty alleviation methods, and work to help people do sustainable farming and a number of different amazing projects that the church that I was a part of was involved in. But the reality is that if then the strong man in the community can still come, and the widow that we worked so hard to help her farm her land and train her son in a vocation, if they can still be kicked off their land by the strong man and have their livelihood removed because this person is more powerful, then all this tremendous work that the church is doing is undermined, right? So we have this history of establishing phenomenal hospital systems and And even the concept, the discipline of social work actually emerged out of the church, right? To think about how do people exist in systems and how do we care about them in systems. If we work hard at educating and caring for their bodily needs, but we don't protect them from the person who can then trap them in slavery, we don't protect them from the person who can abuse them, the child that we're trying to educate, if the school is an unsafe place for them because the teacher is the abuser, then it undermines the phenomenal work that is being done by the church and development agencies around the world. So what we see, when we talk about the locust effect, we talk about it fitting in with the larger whole, that development work is critical and needed. But also, there's a need for work to enforce laws and to protect people from violence, because it makes those other things thrive. It protects the gains made in development.
The name of our podcast is A World of Good, and our goal is just to share the good that God's doing around the world. So is there a story that you can share of the good that God's doing that you've seen or heard about or experienced recently?
There are a lot of just amazing stories that I've heard. One of the things that's been so tremendously encouraging recently has been IJM's launching of the Global Survivor Network, which is a network of survivors that we have worked with over the years that are now taking leadership in informing development agencies and governments as to what really works for their community, what really serves them. And one of the members of that community of survivors is a woman named Jackie from Guatemala. Her story is in some ways typical of the experience of young women in Guatemala. She grew up in meager, circumstances. Her father left home when she was very, very young, but her mother worked hard to ensure that Jackie lived the best life she could, that Jackie was getting an education. She worked hard at really making sure that Jackie could thrive. Then later on, when I believe it was 12 years old, Jackie's father returned to the family home. And this at first seemed like a tremendously hopeful thing, the reunification of her mom and dad. But quickly, sadly, it became something that was really quite the opposite. And her father began to abuse her in secret. And Jackie began to fall behind in school. And her father just tightened this oppressive grip on her family. Jackie's story could have ended there. It could have very easily have ended with this abuse in secret, even if her case was reported. Of the close to 60,000 complaints of sexual violence that were reported, say, between the period of 2008 to 2014, which we studied, only 6.3% ever reached a verdict. So even her hope of getting justice, if she were to take the courageous step of reporting the violence that was happening to her, was exceedingly small. And again, it could have just ended there. It could have just ended in what is unfortunately typical for many survivors of violence in Central America. But thankfully, it didn't. Jackie took the courageous step of telling her mother what was happening. Her mother took the kids and Jackie, and they fled. And where did they find shelter? The first place they found shelter was a church. And through a partnership with the church and with IJM, we were able to take up her case, and we were able to see justice secured in her case. Again, the tragedy of this is that that justice meant that she was again separated from her father, but she was protected from further violence from him. And the bow on the story, really the phenomenal part about this, is that Jackie is now no longer just a person who suffered violence in the past, but she is now a leader. She's actually one of the people on the board of the Global Survivor Network, and now she uses her voice internationally to advocate for survivors worldwide.
That's incredible.
And to call for systemic change and protection of survivors of violence. So this is the kind of story that we get to participate in as the church.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? This is what God's about. He's about taking the brokenness of the world and making beauty out of it, beauty out of ashes. And we see that come to life in a person like Jackie, in a person like Kumar, and over again, so many different stories of the way that God has transformed the life of a person, and then that person becomes a leader for others.
Absolutely. And even in that, like, justice isn't just receiving a verdict. It's a whole life. It's the wholeness and the shalom that comes with a redemption in the sense of in a really difficult situation. So wow, incredible. Okay, so you've hooked us now. We think this is good. We're in with you. What does the church do? What's the role of the church in supporting the work of justice?
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes down mainly to we boil it down to three things. The reality is the church is very creative, and so these three terms are fairly big terms. The first and most important thing that the church can do is to pray. We are grounded in the work of prayer at IJM. It is something we spend an hour out of every day praying. Like, it's an actual requirement.
Wow.
It's part of our employment.
That's incredible.
We begin our day, the first half an hour, in silent prayer individually. Then we come together corporately later on in the day to pray about our greatest needs. And then we take time away every quarter on a prayer retreat to, again, pray.
Wow.
Because we realize, again, it is a reminder that this is God's weight to bear. And so we need people who will pray alongside us, that will ask God to act, that will ask God to come through on our most difficult challenges around the world. So we need people who will partner with us. We also need people who will partner with us in giving. Certainly there is the phenomenal opportunities to partner with IJM. There's a Freedom Partner Program, thinking about individuals and the ways that they can partner with IJM and give. And that is to commit to sending the relief that is so badly needed. And then there's ways that the church can act. And depending on where the church is, right, depending on the country context that we're talking about, there are different ways in which that's expressed, either through advocacy, and encouraging our elected officials to support bills that support survivors or that support action on issues of injustice like trafficking and slavery around the world. There's ways in which the church actually can become active itself. As I said, in some of the country contexts where we work, we have church partners who are running aftercare homes for survivors. We have church partners who are providing legal assistance for survivors. The lawyers that are within the church are saying, I will volunteer my time. I'll be part of accompanying survivors through the justice system. But I think everyone should ask, what is it that God has given me, the 5 loaves and 2 fish that I have to offer back, to see his gospel come to life in the world in the work of justice?
Miguel, thank you so much for taking some time today to share with us. Thank you for the work that you're doing with IJM. We will join you in prayer. And what's really neat is even now, the Church of God around the world is connected with some of the things that IJM is doing. Just for those that are Church of God, we have churches in the Dominican Republic that are working with IJM and connected with the work there. So we're so grateful that we get to partner not just in the United States, but globally with some of the work that you're doing, and can't wait to see where God might lead those relationships in the future. Thanks so much for taking some time to share with us today.
Yeah, grateful to be with you. Thank you again.
Thanks for listening to A World of Good. A World of Good is a podcast production of Global Strategy and Church of God Ministries. Our theme song is Colorado by Leo Flores. If you want to join the conversation, visit us at Twitter at A World of Good Pod, on Instagram, A World of Good Podcast, or visit our website, chogglobal.org/A World of Good. And join us next time as we share more stories of good from around the world.